Hello everybody, I hope you're all doing really well. I'm back up at Little Mountain. If you saw my video last week, it came up to this little area here. It's only a 10-minute drive from where I live, and I haven't really spent much time up here, but there's some gorgeous arbutus trees up here. So I really do need to spend some more time up here doing some photography. What I wanted to do today though is tackle a subject that I've noticed not many people tackle on YouTube. There are just an overabundance of videos about equipment, to some degree technique. In my case, it's more to do with composition in nature, landscape photography, nature photography. So I thought I would tackle the subject and go through some of the things that I look for when I compose a photograph. Now, of course, composition is extremely subjective. What I might like, you may not be that keen on. But the point is to just give you some ideas of things to look for when you're out in the woods looking for compositions. Now, to be honest with you, there's nothing new or revolutionary about the way that I compose images. I do tend to be very careful with the way that I do compose images, and as I've said in past videos, a lot of that has to do with my using large format, quite a few years ago. The thing with large format photography or a large format camera is that when you look through the back of the camera onto the ground glass, you're looking at everything that's upside down and reversed, which makes it quite difficult. It takes a while to get used to. The neat thing about it though is that by doing that, all of a sudden you're not looking at your subject as a specific object. You're looking at your composition more in shapes and how those shapes interact with one another. Now, rather than trying to tackle composition all in just one video, I thought I'd do a whole series of them and kind of spread them out over, weeks or months. So I'm not just going to inundate you with the same thing over and over again. So this week, what I'd like to do is concentrate on light, but how light can influence the way that you compose an image, or how it influences me. And by doing that, it might give you some ideas of how you can utilize those ideas in your own photography. The fog just all of a sudden cleared up, just like that. Right, so let's just get right into the first video, how to utilize light in your compositions. All right. One of the biggest advantages to being a photographer for so long is that after time you end up having quite a large body of work to draw from. So what do I mean by composing for the light? Well, when we think of composition in the more traditional sense, we're usually going after a specific subject. It might be a mountain or a wildflower meadow or a tree in a field or whatever. And we'll base our composition on that subject, whatever drew us to that subject, and try and find a composition for that subject. But when you're composing for the light, what I'm talking about is when you come across some beautiful light in any type of situation, trying to form a composition around that light. It could be the contrast in light, or a contrast in light and color, or a shape that light is forming within a subject. And then I'll try and find some way of showcasing that light in a final image. This photograph here is a good example of kind of what I'm talking about, and actually it relates to what I was talking about earlier with the large format camera, where you look at a subject in the form of shapes rather than what the actual subject is. So in this case, I was really drawn to the light and also the contrast between the direct sunlight and the blue sky reflecting light down into the shadows. And then the warmer light, or the white light, is direct sunlight from the sun. But what I liked about this scene was how the sun was forming these triangles. So on the left side, we have this triangular formation formed by the trees in the shade. And then we have this almost Christmas tree-like effect in the middle from the sunlit trees. And then there's a smaller blue triangle on the right side. And that was kind of what drew me to this composition. It wasn't only the light, but also the shapes within that scene. And I just composed my camera to kind of, make it into a pleasing type of photograph. Now, this was on 4x5 film. So, of course, I was looking at this scene upside down, reversed. Today, if I was going to process this image again, I would probably direct the viewer's attention a little bit more to that central tree. It's quite bright in the lower left side. But I think this image represents what I'm talking about, composing for the light really quite well. Okay, now this next image is definitely all about the light and trying to compose for the light on these trees here. What's happening here is that we have these backlit alpine larch in the Alpine Lakes Wilderness area of Washington. And the conditions were bright blue sunny days, and this is the late afternoon, and the light is just skimming the tops of these trees. So the blue is, like the last photograph, formed by shaded areas, not getting any direct sunlight, so it's just reflecting that blue sky. And then of course we have these larch that are in full color that are heavily backlit. Now I had to move really fast for this photograph because the light didn't last that long, but it's one of those situations where you can't really predict what the light is going to do unless you were there prior and you knew exactly where the light was going to hit these trees. The hard part about photographing this group of trees was trying to keep them separated, and that's something that I look for constantly, especially when I'm photographing trees or woodland, is if you have an individual tree that has some special light on it, is to try and keep it separated from all of the other trees that might have the same light on them, because even though we know something is three-dimensional, as soon as we put it into a flat plane, like on a photograph, anything that's overlapping, it's really hard to see where that separation begins and ends. So that's something to keep an eye out for. I think I did a pretty good job with these trees here. We have two very bright trees on the left, and then the central trees, and then the one on the bottom right, and they're all quite well separated. And of course they have that great blue background, so that separates them even more. The neat thing about this type of light, when you have this contrast in color, is that cool colors tend to recede, whereas warmer colors come forward. So it's a great compositional aid. So if you really want something to stand out, then if you can get some warm light on it and have it set up against a cooler tone, then that'll really bring that subject forward. And here we have a couple more examples, more or less the same subject matter. And actually the first image here was taken in the Alpine Lakes Wilderness, so the enchantments in Washington. It's another image of a larch tree set up against a beautiful contrasting blue background. I was drawn to the light and what was happening with the light, so I composed this image around what the light was doing. And in the second image here, this is another large tree in Yoho National Park or Paven Plateau. But this time the shadows aren't quite as blue because there were clouds in the area, so it's reflecting more of a white light into the shadows. But I really tried hard to set that backlit branch of the larch tree up against a darker background so that we have that beautiful contrast, and it really brings that branch forward. The lighter areas tend to move forward, whereas the darker areas tend to recede. So it just gives it that more of a three-dimensional effect. But again, I was drawn more to the light than anything else, and I just tried to compose this shot around what was happening with the light. Okay, these next couple of images are from the desert Southwest in the United States, and again, I'm looking for compositions that fit the light. Now, in this first image, this was some beautiful light that I found in Zion National Park. It's reflected light, so it's a bright blue sunny day, and I'm in the shade, and the orange light created in this image is actually from a sunlit red sandstone cliff. And then the patches of blue are from the sky above. Now, the only problem with this photograph is that I found the beautiful light, and I found these great diagonal lines that worked really well. But with just those two things in there, it was just too simple, didn't quite work. So the leaf, obviously I did add it, and it somewhat works, but it just looks just too contrived. The colors are beautiful, and this was with my 4x5. So, I'm looking at this scene upside down, reversed. This is a case of where I've found great light, and I'm trying to make a composition work to go with that light. Now, this second image was in Zion National Park as well, a few years later. And again, this is reflected light. So we have a bright blue sunny day, and we have, again, red sandstone cliffs with direct sunlight. We have this beautiful contrast between warm colors and cool colors. And I just love that contrast. Knowing this and having knowledge about this, I started to look for fall foliage that had fallen into the puddles in this side canyon, and luckily I ended up finding a number of compositions with different sets of leaves and so on, but I think this was probably my favorite. And I think in this case it looks quite a bit more natural, because it was natural. It was just some fallen leaves, and I just maneuvered my way around them to find a pleasing composition. Probably the hardest part about finding images like this is trying to keep everything separated and have the subject keep your attention within the frame. You'll notice that the leaf in the bottom is kind of set diagonally, and it leads you into the tip of that other one that's above that kind of curves around. So I think there's enough interest in this whole photograph just to maintain interest in it and keep your eye in the frame. But again, this was all about finding great light and then looking for a composition to fit the light. Okay, now these next few images are probably my best examples of where I've composed my images more around what the light was doing than the actual subject itself. Now, forest photography, as most of you know, and I've said this over and over again, is difficult at the best of times, especially on the west coast of Vancouver Island here, because all of our trees are all conifers. We don't have a lot of trees with individual character, except for perhaps some of the arbutus trees and the oak trees. But the conifers are pretty much all kind of the same. So it's really difficult to go into a woods and find subjects to photograph. It's quite messy. So in a lot of cases, when I go into the woods, I'll actually look for subjects that are lit, and that's how I direct my compositions. So rather than going in trying to find an individual tree that's set apart from other trees, I'll just look to see what the light is doing. And the great thing about the forests around here is that we get a lot of this hanging moss. So whenever that moss is backlit, it really jumps out at you. And all of these examples here have hanging moss in them. Now you may have noticed a bit of a pattern going on here with a lot of these images, and that is that I use contrast a lot in my photographs, and I use that to direct a lot of my compositions. And what I mean by contrast is whenever I have a bright area in a photograph, I always try to set it up against a darker area, because it really does emphasize that light area and just brings it forward. So you'll notice that in these forest images, all I've really done is just concentrated on individual aspects of a tree, say a branch or part of a tree, and then I've tried to set it up against a really dark background. And I think it works really well because it really draws your eye directly to the subject matter, which is the light on that subject. Alternately, I'll also go the other way. If I have a subject that's very dark, then in a lot of those cases, I'll try to set it up against a background that's quite a bit lighter. So we have this constant contrast, or this balance between light and dark. And I think that helps composition a lot. Now, this last image here runs along the same lines, except this has a lot going on in it. So it was very difficult to try and separate all of those branches from one another, but I think it still works. This was an image that I took just a few weeks ago, actually, with a couple from Texas on a one-to-one, and we were driving down one of the many logging roads, just looking for compositions out of the van window. And I saw these trees kind of to the side of the road, and I thought, man, they just stood right out. It was just a beautiful light on these branches. Wasn't a particularly early time of day. It was just, mid-morning. But I think what made it really stand out was that we had these bright branches, but we also had a hillside behind these trees, and it was in deep shadow. So it formed this beautiful contrast between lights and darks. And it's often things like that will attract me to a subject, and that's where I base my compositions on. I'll just keep moving around until I can try and make something work as best as I can make it. And I think it works in this case. Now, I did do quite a bit of dodging and burning. I really burnt in those edges because I really wanted to draw the viewer's attention to those backlit mossy branches, and I think it works. Yes, it's very busy, but as a forest photograph, I think it works quite nicely. Alright everybody, I hope you enjoyed this video. I was a little bit all over the place with this one. 1 minute I'm talking about composition and I'm talking about light, but I hope you kind of got the idea of where I'm going with this and how I try to direct my compositions around what's happening with the light. As I said at the beginning, I will be doing some more videos on composition, and I'll be going over some of the other things that I like to look for when I'm romping around in the woods. One last thing for those of you that might be interested is that I now have what's called a join button, and what this is a subscription-based platform where you can pay a small fee per month to support my channel. And in return, I'll be supplying you with 2 to 3 videos on processing per month. If you don't want to subscribe, it's not a problem. I'm not going to be eliminating videos. All my videos will stay the same. It'll all be free, except for those that want to subscribe to help support me. All right, that's it for this week. Please be sure to give me a thumbs up if you enjoyed this video. And if you didn't enjoy the video, please be sure to hit that thumbs down at least twice. All right, everybody, till next week. Bye for now.